This is Shauna, and she was a new pilot with a lot to look forward to, but unfortunately, an early morning flight with her family turned into a deadly tragedy. However, the truth is that she wasn't the only pilot on board the plane, and that's why I'm going to share with you the real pilot mistake that got her killed. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Shauna was 37 years old and she was one of the pilots flying the plane. She began her flight training in early 2019, over 2 years before the crash. According to this post on Instagram, she spent 8 months secretly taking flight lessons so that way she could surprise her dad, who was also a pilot, and she earned her private pilot certificate on December 12, 2019. Not long after that, Shauna had to put her aviation plans on hold due to her pregnancy, but in August of 2020, she eventually started flying again. That was about 1 year before the tragedy, and that's pretty much all we know about her flight experience because even though the investigation said that Shauna only had about 27 hours of total flight time, the truth is that her logbook was never recovered. However, based on her social media posts and other details within the investigation, she probably had a lot more hours than that, but she was still a relatively new pilot. Sitting in the back of the aircraft was Shauna's husband, James, who was 37 years old. James was a marketing manager for a tech company, and he was not a pilot. However, he decided to join his wife for what was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Also flying with Shauna on this trip was Robert, her 73-year-old father. According to the investigation, Robert had almost 2,300 hours of total flight time, but the NTSB said he had 0 hours in the make and model of aircraft they crashed in. However, that was probably incorrect because he owned the aircraft they were flying in and it had been registered in his name since 2007. So my guess is that most of his hours were in that aircraft. In fact, this is a photo of the aircraft that I found online, and it's a 1973 Beechcraft V-35B Bonanza, which is a 6-seat single-engine aircraft with a V-shaped tail. Additionally, the aircraft had a throwover control column, which is a set of controls that rotates around a center column so they can be moved in front of either pilot during the flight. That being said, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft at the time of the crash, and the weight and balance of the aircraft wasn't a factor either. However, probably one of the biggest threats to this flight was the fact that there was not only a big difference in the age and experience level of the two pilots, but also it was a very unique situation because it was a father and daughter, and unfortunately that relationship is going to play a role in what happened. On July 16, 2021, just before 6 o'clock in the morning, Shauna and her husband and her father boarded the plane at the French Valley Airport in Southern California to make a 2.5-hour flight to the Angwin Airport in the Napa Valley area. The purpose of the trip was to meet up with some friends, possibly to tour some local wineries, but either way, they were on a very tight timeline that didn't allow much room for delays, which is going to turn out to be another factor in this tragedy. In order to discover what happened during the flight, the NTSB had to rely on the ADS-B data from the aircraft, but more importantly, there was a GoPro on board that recorded everything throughout the flight. The NTSB didn't release the video footage or the full transcript, but rather provided a 19-page summary of the flight, including several portions of the transcript that were relevant to the mishap. As soon as they got airborne, they began a left turn to the northwest and climbed to an altitude of about 8,500 feet. Robert was the one initially flying the plane and he was in the right seat, Shauna was in the left seat, and her husband James was in the back. A few minutes after they got airborne, the controller asked if they were going to proceed direct to the Napa County Airport. Robert tried to respond by pushing the microphone button on the yoke to talk on the radio, but the problem was that button was wired for the left seat pilot, so he quickly corrected himself and pushed the button on the panel in front of him. The only reason I bring this up is because it's a mistake that he's going to continue to make throughout the flight, which is going to be a distraction, but I also think it reflects that he was probably used to flying the aircraft from the left seat and maybe didn't have a lot of experience flying in the right seat. At some point during the departure, they moved the yoke to the left side and Shauna took over the controls and would remain the pilot flying for most of the flight. About 30 minutes after they got airborne, she asked her dad about landing techniques in the aircraft, once again highlighting Robert's experience in this make and model. Specifically, she asked him, "Just to clarify, and I'd like to know what you're looking at. And don't tell me you just do it by feel. That's not going to help me. But when you're landing, what are the speeds you want to be at?" Basically, Shauna was trying to learn as much as she could, and she asked her dad if she should be 90 knots on the downwind, and he said no, on downwind you can stay higher, and when you turn base, you should be around 100, and then around 90 when you're on final, and then you can go full flaps. Now, I've never flown this aircraft, so I'm not going to critique his advice. However, it's worth pointing out that the pilot's operating handbook says the landing approach speed is 70 knots, which is 81 miles per hour, and it sounded like Robert liked to fly a little bit fast until landing was assured, and then he would go full flaps and reduce the power to land. Regardless of his advice, as the flight continued, they quickly realized they had a bigger problem they needed to deal with. Although they were flying to Angwin, because that airport didn't have weather reporting services, they had to reference the weather for the Sonoma County Airport, which was about 18 miles to the west of Angwin. When they were about 2 hours from landing, Robert said the current weather at Sonoma was overcast at 700 feet, but Shauna pointed out that it was supposed to get better, with the forecast predicting it to become VFR with scattered clouds at 800 feet around 9 a.m. local time. Keep in mind that's 2.5 hours in the future, which would be about 20 to 30 minutes after they were scheduled to land. The problem with that forecast was that Shauna and her dad didn't have instrument ratings, and that meant they needed to remain clear of the clouds. Unfortunately, the NTSB never provided a full weather analysis, so we don't know what the forecast was when they took off, but my guess is that it wasn't good, so they probably should have had a better plan from the start. As they continued to discuss the weather, Shauna started looking at the University Airport in Davis, California as a potential divert option. However, she told her dad that if they ended up having to divert somewhere, then that would mean she wouldn't be able to make a tour that she had scheduled for later in the day. Now, even though she didn't intend to, as soon as she said that, I'm sure it put a lot of pressure on her dad to make the flight happen. Remember, they took off before 6 a.m. just to try and make it to Angwin on time, most likely knowing the weather forecast wasn't good, and now if they diverted somewhere, they wouldn't be able to make the tour. To make matters worse, the other issue we haven't talked about yet was that Shauna told her dad she was concerned because a friend of hers was picking them up at the airport, but she wanted to let the friend know if they were going to make it or not. However, she needed to give the friend enough notice because it was a 40-minute drive to the airport. Either way, because they had 2 hours left in the flight, Shauna and her dad agreed that they would wait another hour and reassess the weather. Before we look at what happened next, I want to point out that I'm not an investigative journalist, but it shocks me sometimes how much of someone's personal information can be found online. Everyone has a right to stay private and protect their personal data, and that's why I want to thank Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. If you haven't heard of Delete Me, they help protect you against the risk of things like identity theft and phishing scams by removing your personal data from hundreds of data broker websites. Data brokers are basically these companies that are out there collecting huge amounts of your personal information from anywhere they can get it, like social media and public records, and then they sell that information to anyone willing to pay for it. Listen, this is something I take seriously because I want to keep my personal information as private as possible, and that's why I like using Delete Me. In fact, just recently they discovered 64 data brokers with 362 pieces of my personal information that they were able to get removed from me. The best part though is they continue to monitor those brokers in case my personal information shows up again on those sites in the future. Not only that, but they also have a family plan so I can protect the people I care about the most. If you want to protect yourself and your family, you can get 20% off if you go to joindeleteme.com/debrief and use the promo code debrief at checkout, or just scan the QR code that's on your screen. That's joindeleteme.com/debrief and use the code debrief to get 20% off. Instead of waiting an hour to check the weather like they talked about, Shauna only waited about 35 minutes before she said she was going to text her friend to let her know that things weren't looking good. Her dad once again reiterated that the weather was still 700 feet overcast. That's when Shauna realized that the problem was that the Napa, Sonoma County, and University airports were all down near sea level, but the Angwin Airport was on top of a hill at 1,875 feet. This meant that even though it might be 700 foot overcast at Sonoma, it's possible that Angwin was above the weather and VFR because of the higher elevation. Unfortunately, they didn't know for sure, and Shauna started growing more concerned about her friend driving to the airport to pick them up, only to find out they might be diverting. About 15 minutes later, Robert said that he didn't feel comfortable letting Shauna fly from the left seat in marginal VFR conditions, but they never talked about if or when he would take over on the controls. Shauna would go on to tell her dad that although she had no problem diverting, she didn't want to inconvenience her friends and wanted to let them know what the plan was. As you're starting to see, this was becoming a big distraction for Shauna. The truth is that even though Shauna was the one flying the plane right now, she was still deferring to her father to make all of the decisions, treating him like he was the pilot in command. In fact, about 5 minutes later, Shauna mentioned the weather again and asked her dad if he wanted to just call it and go elsewhere, saying that she would be fine with that. Unfortunately, he wasn't really paying attention to her, and when he finally responded, he said, "Let's just get there and see what it looks like." Now, in my opinion, what he should have said was, "Look, we have plenty of fuel. Tell your friends to drive to Angwin to pick you up, and we'll see what the weather looks like when we get there, but I can't make any promises. If we can't land there, it's not a big deal, and we'll go over to University. Now, I know that might suck for your friends, and you'll end up missing the tour, but that's just the way it's going to be, and there's no sense in worrying about it." However, none of that happened, and 10 minutes later, Shauna once again told her dad that she wanted to let her friend know whether to pick them up at Angwin or not. When they were about 40 minutes from the airport, Robert told the air traffic controller that they were going to try and land at Angwin. However, during that exchange, he repeatedly misstated the Angwin airfield identifier numerous different ways, all incorrectly. Shauna tried to correct him, but he kept saying it wrong, and then the controller read back the wrong identifier. Shauna was the only one that caught the mistake and made her dad get back on the radio and state the correction to the controller. Even though this might seem like a minor detail, it's very important for a few reasons. First, this was just going to be one of several minor mistakes that were holes in the Swiss cheese model lining up. Second, poor communication is one of the big signs that you're losing situational awareness. Oftentimes you see this when pilots miss radio calls, they say the wrong thing, or they have incomplete statements, and that's usually because they're fixated on something else. I'm not sure what was going on, but either way, this was just the beginning of Robert's struggles. As they got ready for the approach, Robert got out his handheld GPS and referenced a tab that displayed a calculated rate of descent, and he told Shauna, "This is the rate of descent that will get you to your airport 1 mile away from it at pattern altitude." Shauna asked if he also does the math in his head to verify the calculation, and her dad said no. Why? Shauna tried explaining that she was just trying to learn, and then she got out her iPad and told him the pattern altitude was 2,800 feet. Instead of going over some of those details, all they did was look at the winds at the Sonoma County Airport, and based on that, they decided to use runway 16 at Angwin, and it would be a standard left traffic pattern. 25 minutes before landing, Shauna texted her friend an update. However, 5 minutes later, when they were about 40 miles from the field, Robert said that it wasn't looking good, and once again, Shauna picked up her phone to text her friend. Ironically, earlier in the flight, Shauna told her husband that she didn't feel comfortable flying with her family until she could handle distractions. Despite her concern, it seemed like she failed to recognize how big of a distraction it was to keep providing updates to her friend when she could have easily passed her phone back to her husband and asked him to do it. A few minutes later, when they were about 25 miles from the airport, Shauna asked, "Shouldn't we be descending?" And her dad said, "No, we don't know if we are landing. We can always descend later." Finally, when they were 10 miles from the field, as Shauna was sending another text message, her husband said, "Is that the airstrip straight ahead?" The reason they could see the airfield was because the clouds stopped about a quarter of a mile away from the airport. Even though they had good visibility, Shauna's dad said, "Let me have it," referring to the controls, and they swung the yoke over to his side, and he would remain the pilot flying for the rest of the flight. Now, this is where things start to get out of control very quickly. When Robert began his descent, they were 9 miles from the field and 4,300 feet above the ground. He was initially confused about which runway they were landing on, and Shauna reminded him it was runway 16. Then he tried making a radio call, but he keyed the wrong button and had to correct himself. As they continued to descend, Shauna asked her dad, "Tell me what you're doing." And he responded, "Dropping the gear so I can descend faster." The only problem was the airspeed indicator was showing about 170 miles per hour, which was above the maximum speed for extending the landing gear. Then he asked Shauna what the name of the airport was, and when she told him, he keyed the wrong microphone again and said he was on a high left downwind for runway 16 or 24. He paused and asked Shauna again what runway they were landing on, and she told him again that it was runway 16. However, he didn't believe her, so she told him a third time. But then he started looking around, unsure of where the runway was, and Shauna had to point firmly and repeatedly in the direction of the runway, telling him again, runway 16. As Robert started to turn base, he was 2,000 feet above the ground and doing 160 miles per hour, and the manifold pressure was 18 inches. When he started the turn to final, he was still 1,100 feet above the ground and doing about 150 miles per hour when he appeared to lower one notch of flaps. That's when Shauna asked all the flaps, but she never got a response, and the NTSB couldn't determine the position of the flaps for the rest of the flight. Unfortunately, he ended up overshooting final and was about 30 degrees off center line and trying to correct back. By the time they were on short final, they were still doing 135 miles per hour and 875 feet above the ground. This would have been the perfect opportunity for Shauna to say, "Go around." Instead, she remained quiet and her father continued to struggle. The NTSB couldn't determine how high they were when they crossed the runway threshold, but as Robert tried to round out the aircraft to slow down the rate of descent, they yawed to the left and right and slammed into the runway doing about 85 miles per hour. Both pilots were jostled and the aircraft bounced into the air. Robert tried to make a correction, but his flight control inputs only made the situation worse, and he got himself into a pilot-induced oscillation. They bounced off the runway 2 more times, each as strong and violent as the first, as Shauna tried to brace herself against the fuselage before each impact. Every time they bounced, the pitch angle of the aircraft increased as the pitch oscillations grew stronger, and the NTSB said that the 4th bounce was so hard that it was possible the aircraft had a prop strike with the runway. Keep in mind that if you have a hard landing and bounce off the runway, you might think it's possible to just hold the controls to reduce the pitch oscillations and land the aircraft, but the truth is the best thing you can do is just power up and go around. Shauna probably eventually realized this, but instead of yelling "go around" after the 4th bounce, she calmly said "go around" as if it was a question, once again deferring to her dad. However, this time he listened, and Robert increased the power to 27 inches of manifold pressure and briefly started climbing, but for some reason he looked down towards the throttle area, and when he did, the aircraft settled back onto the runway for a 5th bounce. This startled him and he pulled back on the controls, and the aircraft pitched sharply nose high in the air as the airspeed hovered around 60 miles per hour. Unfortunately, at no point did he ever lower the nose sufficiently for the aircraft to gain airspeed, and as the aircraft struggled to climb, a few seconds later he exceeded the critical angle of attack and stalled, and they hit some trees and crashed inverted not far from the end of the runway, killing everyone on board the aircraft. Let me just say that I know this was a heartbreaking story, but there's a very specific reason why I chose to share this one. Let me show you something. This right here. The NTSB said the probable cause was the pilot's exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack during a hard landing after an unstabilized approach, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and impact with the trees and terrain. Contributing to the accident was the pilot's decision to continue the unstabilized approach. This is why I started making debrief videos. It's obvious that they stalled and crashed after the hard landing, but we need to talk about how they got in that situation in the first place. And I thought there were so many other lessons that we could learn from this tragedy. This was a classic case of get-there-itis combined with poor crew resource management due to a steep authority gradient in the cockpit that was challenging to overcome because of the family dynamic. Either way, in my opinion, Shauna seemed to have a lot more awareness than her father throughout most of the flight. And considering the weather conditions over the field ended up being pretty good, she probably should have just kept the controls and flown the pattern herself like a normal pattern. Unfortunately, we'll never know for sure if that would have made a difference. As a final point, in case you were wondering, despite how tragic this was, James and Shauna's baby was not on board the aircraft when they crashed. I want to say thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. To get your data removed from the internet, check out Delete Me via the link in the description and get 20% off. And also be sure to check out one of these other videos on the screen. And thanks so much for your support.